what is your view on the current economic scenario in India, and where do you think India's economic growth would be in medium to long term?
The Indian economy has rebounded very strongly from the COVID pandemic. We were, of course, growing somewhere in the 9 to 10% range before the latest Omicron wave had happened. That most observers believe is going to have some impact on GDP growth. But because the South African example tells us that this is only going to be a very short and sharp spike, which may not last very long, the view is that the impact on GDP growth will be this quarter, and subsequently we will be able to resume that fast growth, that fast rebound that we were seeing earlier. The government has undertaken very important steps to first strengthen our public health infrastructure, as well as to emphasize support to vulnerable populations, which has kept consumption and demand strong. And then finally, to ensure that productive investments continue to happen in infrastructure. And therefore, all of these have now resulted in a situation where the economy is poised to see a very strong investment cycle. So these policy measures, these policy actions have made a very big difference to the way in which we've handled the COVID economy, and of course, position us for future growth. Now, in addition to that, there are two other factors that are likely to really help us in the medium term. Number one, our exports remain very strong. We are likely to hit $400 billion of merchandise exports this year. The global economy is booming because of the very strong fiscal and monetary support that has been provided. And that is something that is going to help our growth in the medium term. The second reason why our medium-term growth is likely to be very strong is because of the very strong capital flows that we've been getting in terms of investments. So if you look at how much money has gone into our entrepreneurs, to our corporates, that number has exceeded all records in fiscal 22. And so we've produced a large number of unicorns. We've got a lot of capital into our companies. As you know, Reliance just raised more than $4 billion at a very, very low rate. So capital inflow into our entrepreneurial companies has been very strong. Our unicorns have benefited. And of course, exports are strong. And then, as I said earlier, we've got through the COVID economy very well. So when you add up these three aspects of what is happening in the economy, I think everybody would conclude that not only are we going to see growth in fiscal 22 of 9 to 10%, we are also likely to see very strong medium-term growth, hopefully back up at the 6 to 7% growth rate that we have seen prior to COVID.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that in the long term, 6 to 7% growth rate is good enough for India?
Well, India should, of course, grow as quickly as possible. And of course, it would be very good to get up to growth rates that are even higher. But conservatively speaking, I think the building blocks are in place for us to have robust, sustainable 6 to 7% growth. And I think, that is what we are going to see in the medium term. Now, if the global economy remains strong, then our growth rate could even continue beyond 6 to 7% and start to approach 8 to 9%. But that depends a lot on global and external factors. As far as India is concerned, India has taken the necessary policy steps and undertaken the necessary public health and infrastructure investments that will result in quite solid growth for us, 6 to 7% growth for us.
So how big is this risk that, world over people are now saying that the stimulus should be rolled back, taken back, all the liquidity measures that central banks across the globe has taken. So that would impact the fund flow into India. How big is the risk that is?
I don't think that is a risk at all. And the reason is that the monetary and fiscal stimulus that was undertaken in the last 2 or 3 years was undertaken because economic activity was deeply impacted by the pandemic. Now that the pandemic is largely going to come under control, there is no need for that monetary and fiscal stimulus. Economies have once again got back onto the path of growth. And so there is no need for that stimulus because the pandemic is winding down. And in that process, of course, we have been able to provide a lot of stimulus. And so now the economy can take care of itself. So the withdrawal of that stimulus is hand in hand with the handling of the pandemic.
So, sir, given these realities, economic realities, I mean, what should be the focus of the budget this year?
The focus of the budget, I believe, should be in three areas. One is we continue to strengthen our public health infrastructure. As we know, investments in human capital, in nutrition, in the welfare of our mothers is something that is very, very positive when it comes to economic growth. And of course, we've stepped up and accelerated our investments in public health because of the pandemic. But I believe that these public health investments should continue. The second area, of course, is support of vulnerable populations. We have been providing virtually free food grains to 80 crore people. And as required, we should continue to support our vulnerable populations and give them the support both in terms of food grains as well as in terms of Narega and Kisan Samman Nidhi Yojana and so on, also going forward. So support of vulnerable populations. And then the third is, of course, infrastructure. Infrastructure has huge economic multiplier effect on the economy. We have to build out our roads, our bridges, our trains, our airports. All of these elements of public infrastructure, government should continue to pour its fiscal support there. That will drive jobs, that will drive the economic multiplier and drive fast growth for India.
Some people are saying that, like Manrega, we should also have something, urban employment guarantee scheme kind of thing. What's your view on that?
I'm a strong supporter of that. I believe just like we have Manrega in rural areas, I think we should have an urban Narega as well to support the informal sector in urban areas as well. And there are very good, efficient ways of doing that. We are bringing our MSMEs into the digital infrastructure that we have built up. And through Udyam, which is the MSME portal that enables MSMEs to register and digitize their transactions, we have an opportunity now to bring the informal sector right down to the thelawala. So right down to the thelawala, the sabjiwala, we can bring them into the Udyam portal. We can enable them to get digitized. We can enable, much more affordable credit, much more extensive credit to be available to our MSMEs. And if we can do all of that and give them also the social welfare, the insurance, the pension, the healthcare support that we are planning to do for them through Social Security, then we can also provide them the ability to support their informal workers, just like we are supporting Narega. So for instance, if we are paying people, let's say 200 rupees a day in Narega, we could provide people 200 rupees a day for urban informal work also. And of course, MSMEs can top that up and provide additional money as well. So they could provide another 200 rupees. And so then our urban workers could get 400 rupees, 200 rupees coming from the government for a certain number of days a year, and then 200 rupees coming from the MSME themselves. And this, along with a social security package that we can provide them, will enable us to be able to support our urban informal workers also. And, we could make it such that every MSME gets 5 of these or 10 of these kinds of informal workers. So there are ways of designing an urban Narega, given how robust and how transparent our digital infrastructure is right now. I think we can easily make that happen. And so I'm personally a strong supporter of an urban Narega.
This government has undertaken a lot of reforms, but do you think this budget could again take up some more reforms? And if they are, then what reforms those should be?
Again, I'm not able to comment on the budget in any way, Deepak ji. That is what the Ministry of Finance is preparing right now. And of course, it is the silent period before the budget. As I said, in terms of priorities, the priorities we have demonstrated consistently, particularly in these COVID years, has been on public health, it's been on support of vulnerable populations, and it's been on infrastructure. So I expect that these priorities will be continued. That's my personal expectation.
Okay, but sir, if you look at the way the government expenditure this year, I mean, they seem to have been a little tight-fisted. Whether it's the revenue, whether it's the revenue expenditure or the capital expenditure, but while they have been saying that we want to invest a lot on infrastructure, but if you look at the capital expenditure so far, I mean, there's no significant growth. So how do you kind of explain this thing?
I'm not sure that I would accept that characterization, Deepak ji. I think that, the pandemic in April, May, and June of last year, and now again in the fourth quarter, has made it difficult for government to undertake its activities because we've had lockdowns, we've had work from home, and so on. And therefore, government activity at the level that it should have been has been difficult to do because of the lockdowns. And, obviously, it's been difficult to maintain particularly capital expenditures because of the restrictions on economic activity.
Yeah, startups in India have been asking the government to allow them to list overseas. So what's your view on that demand?
That is not a subject that the committee had taken up. So we don't have a committee view on that matter. Again, there are different trade-offs that need to be considered there. And again, it depends on how you enable that to happen. Obviously, on the one hand, you do want to be able to provide access for our entrepreneurs to deep and robust capital markets and capital pools. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, there are concerns about revenue leakage and so on. So those have to be balanced out. And to balance those out, you have to come up with an appropriate set of mechanisms or regulations to be able to, manage a good balance between that trade-off. So we will have to see exactly what the proposals are to that regard.
Do you think we have our ecosystem the startup ecosystem has enough, financing or funding options now in India? Or
I would say, yeah. So we have obviously provided a lot of recommendations on that, Deepakji, in terms of how to enable more capital to flow to our startup ecosystem, which are laid out in our report. We are today getting abundant capital for our startup ecosystem. However, that capital is largely coming from foreign sources. 80 or 90% of it is coming from foreign sources. We would like a lot more equity capital to come to a startup ecosystem from domestic sources. And in relation to that, there are a number of recommendations that we've provided, including the fact that AIFs should be treated on par with mutual funds in terms of taxation, that AIFs should be allowed to list, for instance, that financial institutions in India using fund of fund structures and other structures, insurance companies, pension funds should be allowed to invest in AIFs. So there are a whole host of recommendations that we have provided to enable more domestic capital to flow into equity for our startup ecosystem. At the same time, even as we're talking about equity, we also need more credit to go to our startups. And for that, we are in the process of preparing a report in our committee on financing MSMEs. And it's clear from the hearings that we've undertaken that affordable credit on the right terms is not easily available to our MSMEs. And so the government's already taken a number of steps in that regard, but we need to take further steps to be able to enhance credit to our startup ecosystem as well. So whether you look at it in terms of domestic equity or domestic credit, in both cases, our startup ecosystem needs to be able to get access to more capital, and more policy steps are required to enable that to happen.
So how do you ensure that, there's a system in place where they get cheaper capital, especially the MSMEs?
Deepakji, I'd be happy to have that discussion with you once our MSME report is ready.
Okay.
The committee is working on it. We've had a number of hearings. We've got lots of very useful and valuable recommendations to that regard. And now we have to bring it all together, consolidate all of that within the committee, come up with a very structured set of recommendations, building on the work of the Jayant Sinha committee that was done in 2019. That's what the committee is working on right now. And once that report has been approved by members, tabled in Parliament, approved by the Honorable Speaker, then, of course, we'll release it in the public domain, and I'd be happy to have a follow-on discussion with you about that.
Okay.
So we're in that process.
Yeah. So, sir, while talking about the startup financing, you in that report, you have said that pension funds should invest in startup. Do you think we have, as a as an economy, as a country, have reached that level of maturity where pension money of people can be invested in startups?
The answer is yes, but like everywhere else in the world, there are mechanisms through which that can be done to ensure that sufficient expertise is there to evaluate these kinds of startups. So what we've recommended is a fund of funds structure. So
Okay.
pension funds can allocate money to a fund of funds. The fund of funds will have the expertise, it will have the track record of being able to select good venture capital funds. And then those venture capital funds will then invest in startups. So there are two types of intermediaries that are required between pension funds and startups themselves. One is the fund of funds structure, and then there are venture capital funds themselves, or AIFs. So I think if we put in place those appropriate mechanisms, then good decisions, good investment decisions can be made on behalf of our pensioners.
Okay. Sir, any views on this whole discussion, debate over cryptocurrency, whether they should be legalized or whether they should be banned? Any views on that, sir?
No, the committee has not taken up the matter yet, and we are awaiting the government's crypto legislation that has to be tabled in Parliament. Once it's tabled in Parliament, then of course we'll get a chance to reflect on what the government is proposing, and perhaps if it comes to committee, we'll get a chance to also work on it. So let us wait and see what happens in that regard.
But has the bill been prepared as yet, or is it ongoing?
That's a question you'll have to ask the government.
Do you think the job scenario in the country is little worried? You should be worried about, the government should be worried about that.
All of us need to do much more to ensure that there are better, higher quality jobs that are available to our young people. The government is taking many important steps in that regard. I told you about the investments that are going into infrastructure, which is a huge job creator. You also know that a lot of the jobs are being created by our startups and our entrepreneurs. And of course, again, government has taken many steps in that regard, and the committee also has provided its views there. So yes, it absolutely is important for us to create more high quality jobs. And there are many steps that are being undertaken, and we are absolutely open and are interested from a legislative perspective to see what else could be suggested to government, to the executive, to enable even better employment picture in this country.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thanks for giving your valuable time to us. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care.